Hello, fellow resistors. Welcome to Political Reprobate, the show about how we survive and fight back in the age of white nationalist Christo-fascism. I'm Gemma, former Republican political operative, current political reprobate, and this is a daily podcast about how power really works in America and how we the people can take it back. This podcast exists for one reason: to help you understand what is actually happening in the country so you can resist it intelligently. Subscribe, like, and join the fight. As a former Republican campaign tool, I spent about 6 years helping build the political infrastructure that the current crop of authoritarian assholes is now using to try to break democracy. Well, fuck. My bad. In my defense, back then the Republican Party was mostly a coalition of country club conservatives, evangelical weirdos, and libertarians who thought Ayn Rand was a philosopher instead of a teenage edgelord. The black helicopter conspiracy theorists, who now seem to be the core of the orange fuckwits cult, were just emerging. Now? Now it's a coalition of tech oligarchs, white nationalist influencers, billionaire crypto grifters, and Christian dominionists who would like to replace the Constitution with something ripped from bad Handmaid's Tale fan fiction. So today, we're going to talk about democracy, where it came from, why the founders of the United States broke away from the English monarchy, why they chose a democratic republic instead, and why democracy, messy, loud, chaotic democracy, is the single most important thing standing between us and a bunch of Christo-fascist cosplay shitwits turning America into a theocratic theme park. And yes, of course, there will be swearing. There will always be swearing. It's a Gen X thing. First thing to understand, democracy is not some cute little American invention. Americans love to believe we invented everything. We didn't invent democracy. We didn't invent pizza. We certainly didn't invent cars. Maybe we invented apple pie, but we can barely make decent coffee. Democracy goes back thousands of years. The word itself comes from ancient Greece. Demos means the people. Kratos means power. Democracy literally means power of the people. Wait, what? People have political power? That's news to this fascist regime. Yeah, spoiler alert. It's not just that people have political power, we have all the fucking power. And that is something that terrifies people in positions of authority. In particular, the current crop of shit stains ruining the federal government, disappearing Americans off the streets and out of their homes, and committing war crimes. But getting back to the ancients, the most famous early example of democracy is ancient Athens around the 5th century BCE. But before we start patting those guys on the back, let's be clear about something. Athenian democracy was flawed. Very flawed. Women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote, foreign residents couldn't vote, which meant that democracy applied to roughly 10 to 15% of the population. So yeah, not exactly an inclusive utopia. But the core idea was revolutionary. Instead of a king ruling by permission from the gods or having the most soldiers, citizens governed themselves. Policies were debated publicly. Leaders were chosen by the people. Power wasn't inherited through bloodlines. It was derived from participation. That idea, that authority comes from the consent of the governed, is the seed that eventually grew into modern democracy. And that seed had to fight through centuries of kings, emperors, and religious fanatics who absolutely hated the idea of ordinary people having power. Sound familiar? For most of Western history, political systems worked like this. One guy, usually a king, sometimes a queen, but usually a king, sometimes an emperor, sometimes a pope who thought he was basically both, and that guy ruled because God said so, or because he had the biggest army, or both. The concept was called the divine right of kings, which basically meant God personally chose me to rule, and if you question me, you're questioning God. Convenient. Weird how God always seems to pick the guy with the crown and the army. But over time, people started pushing back. One of the first big moments was the Magna Carta in 1215. English barons went to King John and were all like, "Look, bitch, you may be king, but if you don't sign this document saying you're not above the law, you're going to be a dead king." Guess what? John was persuaded by this argument, and he signed it. Now, this wasn't democracy yet. It was basically rich nobles telling the king he couldn't fuck with their shit anymore. But it planted an important idea. Even kings have limits. Then came the Enlightenment, and this is where things started getting spicy. Philosophers like Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau started arguing that governments exist because the people allow them to exist. John Locke, especially, had a huge influence on the American founders. He argued that people have natural rights: life, liberty, property. And if a government violates those rights, the people have the right to throw that government out. Which, if you're a king, is not exactly the kind of philosophy you want trending on TikTok. Now let's fast forward to the 1700s. The American colonies are part of the British Empire, which at the time was the global superpower. Think modern United States, but with worse food and more powdered wigs. For decades, the colonies mostly governed themselves. They had local assemblies, local laws, a lot of autonomy. Then Britain ran into a problem. War is expensive, and the British government had racked up massive debt fighting France in the 7 Years' War. So Parliament looked at the colonies and said, hey, you guys should help us pay for this, which led to a series of taxes: Stamp Act, Sugar Act, Townsend Act, Tea Act, and the colonists lost their fucking minds. Now, here's the key thing. They weren't just mad about the taxes. They were mad about who was imposing them, because the colonies had no representation in Parliament, which is where the famous slogan came from. The no taxation without representation shit you may remember from school. Except it isn't shit, it's foundational. Because it's another way of saying, if we're going to be controlled by a government, we get a say in the government doing the controlling. That's a democratic principle, the most basic fucking democratic principle. It's the idea that government authority must come from the people. The British monarchy, meanwhile, was like, cute idea, hard pass. Here's some more taxes to fuck your shit up. Things escalated in a huge way. Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, crackdowns, troops in the streets. Sound familiar? Eventually, the colonies decided they were done with that fucking noise. In 1776, they issued the Declaration of Independence. And if you actually read it, which, let's be honest, most Americans don't, it's basically a long legal brief explaining why King George III was an asshole tyrant. But the most important line is this one: governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. That sentence is the philosophical core of American democracy. Government exists because we, the people, allow it to exist. Not because God picked a king, not because billionaires bought a social media platform. The power of government is the people, because the people consent to be governed. And we know what the orange shitwit thinks about consent. Now, here's where things get interesting. The founders believed in democracy, but they were also kind of scared shitless by it. From the writing of the Declaration in 1776 until it was time to write the Constitution in the late 1780s, they had seen revolutions explode across the Atlantic world. They knew mobs could be dangerous. They worried about majority tyranny. So they didn't create a direct democracy like Athens. Instead, they created a democratic republic, which means citizens elect representatives who govern on their behalf. And they built a system full of safeguards. Separation of powers. It's a thing, I promise. Checks and balances. Yeah, too bad Congress isn't alive to do all that checking and balancing. Fuck sticks. An independent judiciary. Some of it. Federalism. Let's let the states have some fun too. A written constitution. All of these mechanisms were designed to prevent any one person or group of people, looking at you fascists, from taking over. The founders were basically building a political machine designed to resist authoritarianism. And for more than 2 centuries, it mostly worked. Not perfectly. God, no. We had slavery, we had segregation, women couldn't vote for most of our history. But democracy has a self-correcting mechanism. Activists push, citizens vote, movements grow. And over time, the circle of participation expands, which is exactly what authoritarians and the people behind them hate. Democracy is messy. It's loud. It's chaotic. It involves compromise. It requires listening to people you disagree with, which is basically kryptonite for people who believe they are divinely ordained to rule. Enter the modern American far right, and specifically the ideology sometimes called Christian nationalism or Christo-fascism. Now let's unpack that, because this movement isn't about religion. at all. It's about using religion to gain power and keep it. The core belief is that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, which is historically false, and that government should enforce a specific form of fundamentalist Christianity, the kind of Christianity that Jesus wouldn't recognize. But there's another element layered on top: white nationalism. Many of the leaders in this movement openly talk about preserving Western civilization, which is code for white, Christian, patriarchal authoritarianism. Democracy is a huge problem for this worldview because democracy means everyone gets a voice: Black Americans, women, immigrants, LGBTQ citizens, religious minorities. And when more people have a voice in democracy, the Christo-fascist agenda becomes deeply unpopular. So instead of winning Democratic support, which they know they can't, the shitweasels try to break the system. Now let's talk about the tech billionaires for a minute. Because if you've been paying attention to Silicon Valley politics lately, or if you heard the last episode of this podcast, you've probably noticed something weird. A bunch of tech oligarchs have suddenly become very interested in authoritarian governance models. They talk about things like network states, startup nations, CEO-style leadership, which sounds cool if you're pitching a crypto startup, but it's terrifying as fuck if you're talking about actual countries with actual human beings living in them. These guys believe that democracy is inefficient, which, no shit, it's designed to be. That it's too slow, too messy, has too many voters. They look at government and think, this should be run like a tech startup. But countries aren't startups. Citizens aren't users. And democracy isn't supposed to optimize shareholder value or whatever the fuck they want. It's supposed to protect human rights and serve the needs of its people. But when tech billionaires start aligning with far-right political movements, you get a dangerous combination: money, media platforms, propaganda networks, and authoritarian ideology. That's how democracies start to erode. Not overnight, but slowly, institution by institution, norm by norm. This is what we've seen for the last dozen or more years. Okay, deep breath. This is the part where people start to feel hopeless, and I get it. But here's the thing: democracy has survived worse. It survived civil war. It survived the fascist movements in the 1930s. Yeah, those were happening here too. It survived Watergate. Yeah, wow. The salad days when Watergate was our worst political scandal. Am I right? But democracy survives because ordinary people defend it. They work hard for it. And that means doing the unglamorous stuff: voting, organizing, running for local office, supporting independent journalism, calling out disinformation, and refusing to let authoritarians normalize their bullshit. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It's more like a punk concert. Everyone participates. It's loud, sometimes very loud. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes someone gets elbowed in the mosh pit. But the energy comes from the crowd, not the stage. So if you take nothing else from today's episode, remember this: democracy is not perfect. It's slow. It's frustrating. It involves arguing with your uncle at Thanksgiving. But the alternative is a system where power is concentrated in the hands of kings, oligarchs, or self-appointed religious rulers. And history has shown us over and over how that story ends. Spoiler alert, it ain't good for anyone. So yeah, democracy is messy, but messy beats fascism every single time. Stay loud, stay skeptical, and for the love of everything holy, use your voice. I'm Gemma, former Republican political operative, current political reprobate. Join me. We're just getting started.